The following broadcast was produced by the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco as part of our Lighthouse Learning Library.
I want to introduce Stacy Cervenka. Stacy is somebody I met when she was, I think, a high school senior, a year probably both of us would like to forget. And Stacy has gone on to finish her education and to get a series of more and more impressive jobs and finally land 5 years with Senator Brownback and to do that job as legislative aide and to do it for in the U.S. Capitol. And to do that as a blind woman using alternative techniques is something that Stacy has taken very seriously. She's interested in 3 skills in particular that any blind person can't do without. So let me just introduce Stacy, and she's going to tell you what those are. Stacy.
Thank you, Brian. Trying to figure out how to...
I know it's like a war. The war of the microphone and the holder. There we go. There you go.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Brian, for inviting me here. As Brian mentioned, my name is Stacy Cervenka, and for the past 5 years, I worked as a legislative assistant for Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas. And throughout my time in his office, I advised the senator and wrote and worked on legislation pertaining to many different policy items, including adoption and foster care, child protection, juvenile justice, pro-life issues, disability rights, special education, vocational rehabilitation, Native American issues, Second Amendment rights, Social Security, pensions, labor issues, NASA, commercial spaceflight, North and South Korea issues, and randomly postal issues. That one was my favorite. No, not really. Actually, I will tell you, I actually enjoyed meeting with postal workers more than just about anybody else because I'd always meet with these really high-powered, highfalutin lobbyists, and then whenever I met with any postal people, they were always just these nice elderly letter carriers from rural Kansas, and it was such a pleasure to meet with them because I really felt like they weren't, of all the people I met with, they were the most real, and they were the most, Kansan. I was also Senator Brownback's liaison to the Senate Special Committee on Aging. My time in the senator's office was filled with so many extraordinary moments. When I was working there, I often told people that I felt like I had once-in-a-lifetime experiences once a week. I co-wrote a bill that is now a law. I sat in my boss's office and made conversation with Buzz Aldrin, who, by the way, thinks we should colonize the moon. It's interesting. We were talking about our mission to Mars, our manned mission to Mars, and he said, well, when we first came to the United States, we didn't just touch it and come back. We put up a mission, or we put up a colony there, and we all kind of looked at each other like, who's volunteering? Who wants to live at Mars for the rest of their life? I got a long smoochy kiss from Bono. Senator Ted Kennedy personally introduced me to his dog Splash, and I'll just let y'all handle that one. And I'm one of a few people I know who have ever actually been inside North Korea and actually had a sniper pointed at my head, which is kind of interesting, and I'll talk about later. But today my goal is not to bore you to death with all of my fish stories, but I believe that we do gain at least a little wisdom from each life experience we have. So I'd like to share with you some of the wisdom that I've gleaned from my experiences in the workforce. Now, although there is no one-size-fits-all secret to success, I do believe that blind people can do a few things to enhance their chances of finding a job that's fulfilling and hopefully well-paying and right for them. In my opinion, there are 3 critical skill sets and 1 critical personal characteristic that are essential to cultivate in order to land and keep a good job. The 3 skill sets I'd like to talk with you today are about your blindness skills, about your advocacy skills, and about your relational skills, or as Peggy called them, your soft skills. The first thing I'd like to talk to you all about is your blindness skills. And I know that this is a very boring topic for many of us. We've heard it again and again and again. We've heard lots of people tell us about the importance of having good blindness skills, and it's kind of yesterday's news. However, when the rubber meets the road, you gotta have good blindness skills. if you can't do what the employer is asking you to do, they're not going to hire you. And if you do land a job and you can't efficiently perform the same tasks as your colleagues, you probably won't keep that job very long. And if you do, you're unlikely to advance within your organization. So what are blindness skills? Does anybody? Mobility, I heard someone say. Facing directly at people, facing people directly when you're speaking to them, Braille, assistive technology. Okay, so we're all on the same page. We all know what we're talking about when we're talking about blindness skills. And I'm going to call these blindness skills, although frankly, you could call them low vision skills as well, because I would consider learning how to use a CCTV or learning how to use magnification devices. Those are often, those I would put under the umbrella of blindness skills as well. How to drive, I think in the future that might be a blindness skill. That'll be added on to mobility. But so in my personal situation, my job required many different blindness skill sets. I needed to be able to do effective research both online and with print media. That means I needed to have good adaptive technology skills, and I needed to be able to access print. When I went into a meeting with somebody from the foster care system, they didn't hand me something in Braille. They handed me, a giant print binder or a portfolio filled with print papers. I needed to know how to take that print and convert it into a file that I could use, or convert it into a medium that I could use. I needed to be able to use the computer to communicate with colleagues, constituents, and other stakeholders, and to write letters, emails, and memos. I needed to be able to travel independently to meetings both on and off Capitol Hill. When I first started the office, it was part of my job to be a tour guide of the U.S. Capitol building. So I needed to have good mobility skills. I often attended events from early in the morning until late at night on my own, on and off the Hill. I needed to be able to both get to those events, and then often they weren't the kind of events where you would simply sit down. They were, unfortunately, the kind of events where you would walk around with a wine glass or a little piece of fish perched precariously on your wine glass. I needed to be able to take concise, effective notes in meetings with constituents and lobbyists that involve both Braille and adaptive technology. I also needed to be able to access the information on the handouts and reports the constituents and lobbyists gave me in these meetings. So really, I used just about every type of adaptive skill you can think of. I used mobility to get to work. I used mobility on the job. I used Braille. I used adaptive technology. I didn't necessarily cook for work, but I needed to keep myself fed enough to get to work and do the job. So, maybe the job that you personally want doesn't require the exact skills that I just mentioned, and maybe not in varying degrees. Maybe the job you want requires a little bit more access technology knowledge than what I had, but less mobility. Maybe it requires more home ec skills, but less Braille. But the fact is, it's surely going to require some of all of the blindness skills. And you really need to ask yourself some hard questions. You need to ask yourself, what are you going to do when your boss puts a stack of papers on your desk and says, I need a report on this tomorrow? What are you going to do? You need to ask yourself, what are you going to do when your boss says to you, so-and-so, I need you to attend a meeting that I can't make after work, and the agency needs to send somebody, and it's going to be you. You need to attend it by yourself. You need to figure out how to get there, and you need to take notes, and you need to meet with these people, tell them this information, and then get back to me with what they said. Are you able to do that? Are you able to take notes? Are you able to take notes in a way that you can read them? Are you able to take notes in a way that somebody else can read them, a colleague or your supervisor? So blindness skills are very, very important. And I think, here you guys have a wonderful opportunity in Enchanted Hills Camp to really hone some of those blindness skills. You're in an area where we're not going to judge you too much. We'll laugh with you. I understand that when you're in a restaurant, sometimes it might feel intimidating to use your cane to go find the bathroom by yourself if you haven't had good mobility training, or, if you're going somewhere you've never gone before, it seems intimidating because if you get lost, maybe you'll think you look foolish. Here at camp, everyone wants to help you. And I think everyone would love to say, look, you'd like to carry your tray to to the table, here's how I carry my tray, or, oh, here's how I shoreline, or, oh, here's how I use a sound cue to tell where I'm going, here's how I pour my drink. So really make use of this opportunity at camp, not only to listen to some great speakers, but, if you're not serving yourself, cutting your own food, bussing your own table, walking around camp independently, this is a great time to ask the people around you, hey, I saw that you served yourself. Can you show me how you did that? And we're not here to judge each other. We're here to help each other. We're on the same road. We're all on a journey, and none of us know everything, but all of us know something. So I think this is a really good opportunity to kind of let yourself drop your guard a little and really admit what you don't know and allow yourself to learn. Now, on a more abstract level, but just as important, we have our second skill set, which would be the soft skills or the relational skills. For my job, I needed to be able to walk into a meeting and both put people at ease and get them to take me seriously. That was one of my biggest fears when I first started taking meetings on my own. Actually, it was one of my fears when I first started doing tours. The first time I walked out to do a tour by myself, I was not afraid that I was going to lead people astray, or that I was going to get us lost, or that I was going to tell them something incorrect and point to a drinking fountain and tell them it was a lovely statue of Pocahontas. What I was worried was that how are these people going to react to me? When I come out, is it going to be awkward? When I come out, are they going to be reluctant to go with me? Are they going to ask for somebody else? Are they going to say, never mind, we didn't really want to do this anyway? So, it was very scary. And the first time I walked into a meeting with about 10 school superintendents and school board presidents, who were all very distinguished people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, with over 20 or 30 years of experience, I was terrified that they were all thinking, who is this 20-something little blind girl fresh out of college, and why are we meeting with her? We're here to talk about important things. She's probably interested in Miley Cyrus, which of course I'm not. No, I'm not, just what they might have thought. So besides actual concrete skills, I had to have at least some people and relationship skills. I also had to deal with not only the constituents who came in, but I had to deal with my colleagues. I had to be able to explain to them how I was going to do, beyond that, because I guess that's kind of our next skill, but I had to be able to relate to them. I had to be able to make conversation at the water cooler. I had to hang out and go to happy hours. I had to be comfortable doing this, making small talk. I tell you honestly, one of the things I think I learned the most about when I first started in the senator's office, one thing that I hated doing more than anything else was showing up at some sort of giant fundraiser or reception where I didn't know anyone in the room and there was nowhere to sit and everyone was just walking around with a glass of wine and a plate of hors d'oeuvres talking to each other. I just thought, oh man, what do I do? I mean, this is awful. It just takes diving in. It just takes doing it again and again and again. I think developing those relational skills it's so critical. Finally, the third set that I'd like to talk about before we go a little bit more in depth is our self-advocacy skills. As a blind person, I had to have a good set of self-advocacy skills. Our office had never had a blind employee before, so I had to tell them what kind of technology I needed, where they could get it, and how I would be able to handle other tasks, like reading the huge amount of mail that came across my desk, giving tours of the U.S. Capitol building, and shepherding VIP constituents wherever they needed to go. Now, the other staffers in my office believed that I could do all these things, but they had no idea how. It was my responsibility as an employee to figure out how I would get things done and communicate any needs I had to the appropriate people. It's up to you how you choose to do these things, but you need to be able to communicate to your employer how you're going to get things done. So many people with disabilities, I remember we once had a deaf intern, and she showed up on the first day, and she just assumed that we would have an ASL interpreter. What you need to understand is, if you're not working within the blindness field, they have no idea how a blind person operates. You're not going to show up and find JAWS preloaded on your computer. You need to know what you need. And you can't show up and say, well, I'm not sure how I can do that, but maybe you could figure out a way. That's not their business. Their business is to do what their job is. Your business is to do what your job is. So you need to know how you're going to do what you're going to do beforehand. It's kind of like what Mike said, the woman who walked into an interview for a a customer service job and she barely knew how to type. That's not their responsibility to teach you how to type. You need to talk to your rehab counselor. You need to talk to the folks at the Lighthouse. You need to talk to other blind people. But that's your job before you even walk in to make sure that you have the skill sets that are required. It's also, I think, when talking about self-advocacy, it's really, really important to get yourself plugged into a group of other blind people. Whether that's a consumer group, whether that's being affiliated very closely to an organization for the blind like LightHouse. Frankly, I really strongly recommend getting involved with at least one of the consumer groups, whether it's NFB or ACB. I recommend maybe going to both conventions and checking them both out. There are a lot of people who choose to affiliate with both. But like Mike said, they're an excellent way to really find out what are the laws that are affecting blind people, what are the technologies affecting blind people, what are the latest and greatest, practices in the rehabilitation field. I mean, if you have not been involved with consumer organizations, chances are you're relying on what your rehab counselor tells you about latest technology. And as we all know, that's probably not the greatest idea. You need to know from other people who are on your road, what they're using, whether that's technology, whether that's, legal advice, and there's really no better place to get it than the consumer organizations, in my personal opinion. That kind of feeds into knowing the law, knowing your rights. You need to know about the ADA. You need to know about your rights as a client of rehab. You need to know about the Rehabilitation Act. You need to know about Section 504. I mean, you need to know about the laws that affect your life as a blind person. And you can study these, but I seriously think there's no better way to learn than to get involved with one of the consumer groups and to really learn the ins and outs of these laws. It's up to you how you choose to acquire the skills that I've talked about and what exact combination of visual and non-visual techniques you use. But all blind job seekers need to ask themselves seriously and strive to answer honestly, do you have good blindness skills? Do you have good relationship skills? Do you deal with people easily? Do they enjoy putting up with you? Do you have good self-advocacy skills? Do you know your rights? Do you know your responsibilities? Can you communicate with other people effectively your needs and also your rights? How will you handle it when your boss dumps a stack of papers on your desk and tells you he needs a report on Tuesday? How will you deal with traveling to meetings in unfamiliar destinations with little advance notice? Do you get along and relate easily with other people? Are you currently able to advocate effectively for yourself without calling on your parents or disabled student services? Frankly, in the workforce, most of the time, mom's not going to be there, nor is your disabled student service worker, nor is your rehab counselor. They might help you during part of the process, but in the day-to-day world, they're not going to be there. So how will you explain your abilities and your needs to your colleagues and your supervisors and your clients and constituents in a way that is clear and confident, but not defensive or confrontational? You have to keep in mind, you're working with people. They're not out to get you, and you shouldn't be out to get them. You want to work and relate well with people. So whether you use visual or non-visual techniques, whether you acquire your skills through a training center, I acquired my skills through a residential training center called the Louisiana Center for the Blind. I know many people who have gone to many different training centers, whether they've done home-based rehabilitation programs. Some people have pick them up from family and friends and other blind people they've met at meetings just like this. But you need to make sure that you are physically and relationally capable of the day-to-day grind of a typical workplace. That means learning to get up early. I mean, like Mike said, if you're sleeping until 3 every afternoon, unless you're applying to be a night security guard, you're not going to be physically, working is very different than college. In college, you go to class, 2 hours a day, 4 days a week, call it good. When you're working 8 to 10 hours a day, at least. And you're starting at 7, 8, or 9 in the morning, and you're going to 5, 6, 7 at night. I mean, your body needs to get used to that. You need to be physically ready to work. You need to be relationally ready to work. If the only person you've talked to in the last 2 weeks is on Facebook, I mean, I joke, but you need to think about that. Now, if you think that cultivating all these skills sounds like a lot of work and sounds tiring, that's only the half of it. You can have all the skills in the world, but skills alone aren't enough. We all know people who are great cane travelers, but the only time they put those mad mobility skills to use is when they take the subway to the bar or go to sit around with some other unemployed friend. We all know people who are great Braille readers, but, they've never had a job in their life. So having the skills alone is required, it's necessary, but not sufficient. The other, besides the 3 sets of skills that I was talking about, I'd also like to talk about one extremely important personal characteristic. And I'm calling it courage, but you can call it motivation, you can call it, balls, you can call it whatever you want to call it. And I know that we in the blind community have a hard time with the word courage sometimes because we're all tired of the worn-out cliches that, wow, blind people are so courageous every time we show up in public and don't drool on something, and, every time, wow, you tied your shoe, that's so amazing, oh my goodness, you used a fork and you actually found your mouth with it, that's incredible, I'm really proud. I once had a lady, that was the hardest thing for me. I remember walking into meetings, it wasn't difficult for me to deal with a lot of things on the Hill, but I never found a way that I was satisfied with to walk into a meeting and have somebody say, wow, you're so inspirational, before I'd even done anything. And I remember this one time I walked into a meeting and this lady said, oh, what's that? And I was like, oh, it's my cane, and I'm blind. And she's like, well, you are just amazing. And I'm thinking, why? Because I walked in the door and I, didn't knock something over 5 seconds upon entering? I mean, how do you know anything about me? For all you know, I could sit down and be a complete incompetent buffoon. I mean, your expectations of blind people have been raised because I managed to take 2 steps into a door. But I mean, I didn't say that, but it's, exactly. So I know that we kind of have an interesting relationship with the word courage. However, it does, in my opinion, take courage to put ourselves out in unfamiliar situations where we're not certain whether we'll be welcomed and how we'll be perceived. The fact is that negative stereotypes and misconceptions do exist. Prejudice, discrimination, and unfair treatment are very real. Nobody likes to feel rejected, underestimated, or ignored. Therefore, it's understandable that we sometimes shy away from situations that might result in these unpleasant feelings. However, when we avoid situations that carry the risk of rejection, we rob ourselves not only of many marvelous opportunities, but also of the strength and courage that come from facing our fears. Applying for any kind of job, internship, or volunteer position carries with it the potential for unfair rejection. It's just a fact of life. However, one way to ensure that you'll never get hired is constantly to pass up opportunities for fear that you'll be unfairly treated anyway. This lesson came sharply into focus a few months ago when I was attending a conference of the Mitsubishi Electric America Foundation. The director of human resources at one of the Mitsubishi branches told me that he'd really like to hire more people with disabilities. The problem, he said, was that Mitsubishi often posts job announcements on Monster.com and other job databases, but no one with a disability ever applies. He then said that Mitsubishi often has booths at college job fairs and community job fairs across the country, and he rarely sees students or other job fair attendees with visible disabilities at the job fairs. And he asked me in complete earnestness, and it's kind of a naive question, but he asked it in good faith, and I believe his intentions were sincere, but he asked me why, if there were so many qualified unemployed people with disabilities, he never seemed to run into them at job fairs or through the main channels through which Mitsubishi recruits. And I thought about his question for a while, and I understand that there might be many reasons for this, much more than we could even talk about in this speech. But I think one of them is that we're often so fearful of discrimination that we tend to look for jobs with agencies we already know. We wait for job announcements to make their way across the NFB or ACB lists or into the Braille monitor, and with the idea that if people are posting a job announcement directly onto an NFB or ACB publication, obviously they're open to hiring blind people. Now, seeking out jobs on Monster or Craigslist is sometimes more risky since the possibility of discrimination is so strong. And we think that the employer probably won't hire us anyway, so all of our efforts will be for nothing. It takes a certain amount of courage and good faith for a person with a disability to apply to a mainstream job announcement. The fact is that the percentage of jobs that will be forwarded to blindness-related listservs and published in blindness-related newsletters is very, very small. It's very, very small. In order to make ourselves available to the widest variety of jobs, we're going to have to get out of our comfort zones. I attended a conference on including students with disabilities not too long ago, and one of the presenters said that he often asks, he talks about how teachers are often reluctant to have students with disabilities included in their classrooms. And they say, their main thing is, I don't have enough training to handle this, I don't have enough training to handle this. And one thing he often asks them is, well, when will you know that you're ready to have kids with disabilities in your class? When will you know that you've had enough training? And the teachers often respond, when my fear goes away. And so the fact is, and this I think relates to our job process, is your fear doesn't go away based on training. Your fear doesn't go away until you jump in feet first and actually, in the case of the teachers, actually get to know these kids. You can have all the training in the world, attend all kinds of sensitivity trainings and seminars, but until you have a kid in a wheelchair in your class and you realize this is just a kid, I don't need to be super specially, medically, crazily trained for this. It's just dealing with a person. There are a few things to, a few kind of common courtesy etiquette things that are good to know, but you're not dealing with, a robot. You're dealing with a human being. I think it's the same for us. You can have all the training in the world. You can have great mobility skills. You can go to all the blindness seminars you want and, get more and more and more and more training, but your fear isn't going to go away until you actually start applying for those jobs and go out on your first interview. The courage it takes to apply for a job will certainly serve you well once you do enter the workforce. I remember when I first started giving tours of the U.S. Capitol building to Kansas constituents who were visiting D.C., like I mentioned before, I was terrified. And I wasn't worried about getting them lost. I was worried about how they would react to me. Would any of them ask for a different tour guide? More likely, would the entire tour be awkward and uncomfortable as they tried to pretend my blindness didn't exist? However, giving tours helped me learn a valuable lesson that has stood me in good stead ever since, and that is acting is believing, aka fake it till you make it. I may have felt apprehensive, but I didn't have to act like I was. Before my first tour, I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and breezed into the front office to meet our guests. I acted as though I'd been giving tours for years, and I made no attempt to hide my blindness, but I made no big production of it either. I really didn't talk about my blindness personally, at least in the beginning of the tour, but, I used my cane, I had it out, I didn't make any effort to hide it. One thing people on my tours always commented was and I learned this from Lisa Maria Martinez, who actually works at the Lighthouse, but I often gave part of my tours walking backwards with my cane behind me, shorelining the wall, finding doors. And I said, and that's sometimes when I would say to people, I think I feel sorry for my sighted tour guide colleagues because they can't walk backwards and speak to you guys. They either have to yell really loud over their shoulder or stop every 5 minutes to face you. So it was kind of an asset for me because I could face my tour group the whole time and not have to yell at them. But my first tour went very well, and my nervousness didn't dissipate right away. However, after a few weeks of playing the role of a confident tour guide, I slowly became one. And I can honestly say that within a month, my blindness and other people's possible reactions to it never even crossed my mind as I went out to greet guests. After a few weeks, I'd be busily working. My tour time would come around. I'd pick up my cane. I'd walk to the front office, and I'd still be thinking about what I was doing before. Like, it never even occurred to me to be concerned about their reactions to my blindness. And I never had, I'm sure there was things that, people looking at each other and, whispering something, but nothing ever came to my attention. Nobody ever dropped out of a tour. We never got really lost. A few times we got quarantined in the rotunda because of mysterious packages, but that wasn't my fault. But as a blind person in an integrated workforce, you will have to venture outside your comfort zone fairly regularly. This takes a certain amount of willingness to look your fear and apprehension in the face, deal with them, but not let them stop you. Another time, I would say this was probably the most afraid I've ever been. I went to do something. I traveled to South and North Korea as part of a congressional staff delegation back in 2010. And I'd traveled overseas before, but I'm fluent in French, and I'd traveled in France, and so it didn't seem so scary to me because I'd studied the language and culture. I knew nothing about Korean. All I knew how to say was, "How are you?" which I've forgotten. It's like, "Kinyaseho," or, so yeah, there you go. I knew how to say kimchi. I knew how to say, So I knew North Korean Airlines, Koryo Airlines, that's about it. But so I hadn't studied the culture enough to really feel confident traveling alone. And it was literally me and 6 other congressional staffers from other offices that I did not know. They were all from the House side. I didn't know a single one. So I showed up at the airport, never having met these people. Actually, we'd had a dinner the night before. But I showed up at the dinner the night before, met these 6 people I'd be traveling with for the next week, and that I felt, oh my gosh, I'm really going to be depending on these people. And, it scared me a little bit. We also, an interesting detail that we took the polar route. We didn't fly east or west from DC. We actually flew north and went over the North Pole and then down through Siberia onto the Korean Peninsula. And even that I thought was crazy. I was like, oh my gosh, we're flying over the North Pole. Is that even safe? That sounds crazy. Like, what if we get, ice crystals in the wings or the fuel line freezes? And so, all kinds of things about this trip were scaring me. And I even thought about bowing out, like, oh, do I have to go on this? Is it really, really going to help me? And, thankfully I didn't bow out because it was one of the most incredible weeks of my life. And the funny thing is, once I got to the airport that day, it was smooth sailing. I wasn't afraid. Thinking about it was sort of terrifying. Like, oh my gosh. I had colleagues who told me about, oh, they are going to spy on you. South Korea, they're friends, but they are interested in our intelligence, so don't leave. We had to get all these security plastic bags to put our phones in. And we had one guy he had this interesting story. He was in the shower, and the mirror in his shower was all fogged up, except for one little square of mirror. And so knowing that, oh my goodness, would I ever really be alone? It was really scary. And who are these people? I've met them at one dinner. How can I, what happens if my cell phone isn't going to be working? I have the international BlackBerry, but all it's going to do is email. It was really scary. So, I think there are always going to be situations, even after you've gotten the job, where you're going to be asked to put yourself outside your comfort zone. So it's again, it's an ugly reality, but we need to acknowledge that discrimination really does exist, and rejection and prejudice really does exist, and we can't whitewash it away and pretend that if we just get enough skills, it's all going to be great, because that's just not true. But on the other hand, we can't run away from them. We need to meet them head on. So I really think that kind of the answer, if there is an answer at all, really is to have both good skills and to be courageous about the way that you confront the job market and the way that you confront your job once you do have it. It's not enough to have good skills and to have prejudice out there, but it's also not enough to have willing employers and not to have good skills. I can say, okay, I'd like to hire a blind person. I believe in hiring marginalized populations, but if you can't do the job that I want you to do, I'm not going to hire you. So I really encourage you while you're here this week to just take an honest look at yourself, and both mentally and physically, and ask yourself, do you have the skills that it takes to be employed? Do you have good mobility skills? Both whether you're totally blind or partially sighted, or can you navigate independently? Can you read Braille? If you can't read Braille, can you read large print effectively? Can you read it at the same speed as your sighted colleagues, or at least close to that? Can you read what you write? If not, you need to really seriously think about possibly learning Braille or using more adaptive technology. But you really need to ask yourselves those questions. Do I get along well with people? Am I constantly cranky? And I just hope that the answer is yes, I'm constantly cranky. But you need to really ask these questions of yourself, and use this as, pretend it's a work conference, and network with each other and mingle with each other and befriend each other. A lot of people are not nearly as lucky to be invited to an event like this. So you guys are really, really fortunate. So many blind people in the state of California do not have the opportunities and the resources that you guys have just by virtue of being here this weekend. So it's, Mark Twain, one of my favorite quotes is by Mark Twain, and he says that the man who can read great books but chooses not to, is no better off than the man who's illiterate. And to me, it's the blind person who has great skills and has resources and has networking opportunities and chooses not to really make use of them and really gain from them and then put them to use in their lives, is really no better off than the person sitting home in their rocking chair. So thank you all for having me, and any questions?